first of all, I'd like to say that we will be me and Catherine running this seminar, webinar. Catherine Clothier in UK. Phil, who usually does this together with me, is on a plane flying over the Atlantic. And so I'm happy to have Catherine here. She has a cold, but she's fine.
I'm fine, thank you.
Yeah. And then I'm also very glad to have Ruth Steinholz as a guest speaker to be able to share her experiences from ethical business practice and regulations. Ruth has extensive experience in this field and is a renowned speaker in this area, and also has written a book which if you're interested in the subject, I highly recommend. It's not about selling the book, but it's a good book if you are interested in this field. But I think the most interesting part of this book is actually the subheading, a behavioral and values-based approach to compliance and enforcement. And I think that kind of titles very well what you're going to talk about. So I'm very happy to have you here. I'm going to send you all a little chat in your chat box here as well, and I see that some of you have already been in these meetings before, so you have already started to say your name and where you are calling from, but now you can then follow in the chat box people from US, from the Netherlands, from UK, from Mumbai in India, I see as well, and Madrid in Germany. So a lot of people are joining in from all over the world as usual. Very, very happy that we have so many people coming into these seminars. Now, I'd like to hand over and I'm going to start recording.
I've done it too.
Perfect. Hand over to Ruth so that you have your presentation, and during the presentation we encourage you to write in your questions as Ruth is speaking, because you are all muted and your questions needs to be written in, and then we'll come back to them at the end of the presentation, and if there are anything urgent that we need to know before that, you can then that we need to announce to Ruth, you send that into the chat box. With that, I'm really looking forward to this. I know that Ruth has a very important message to send to you all, and so I give the floor to you, Ruth.
Thank you, Tor and Catherine. So first, shall I say, I also have a cold. I'm hoping that I'm not going to have a major coughing fit, but if I do, I'm prepared with cough medicine, honey, tea, everything, and I'll try to deal with it quickly. Can everyone see my screen that has the presentation on it, blue and white? Hopefully you can. If you can't, please let Tor know in the chat box.
I think, yeah, exactly. I will see that we can right here. So
okay, brilliant.
Clive Wilson.
So I thought, given that this is Barrett Value Center, it would be useful just to start very quickly with some of my important values. Ease with uncertainty has been a particularly important value the last 3 years here in the UK, where I live and have lived for many years. I wish that perhaps more people have that value at the moment, but also humor, fun has been extremely important, since given what's going on here, without it, one might actually lose one's mind. But I'm hoping that through the work that I'm doing and the book that I co-wrote, we'll explain that in a little while, to be able to make a difference in my own modest way. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to explain to you very briefly who I am and how I got here. Then we're going to talk a little bit about why good people do bad things. And the reason we're going to do that is because it's very much related to culture. And then I'll tell you a little bit about what is ethical business practice and regulation, and what does it have to do with CTT. Briefly talk about how compliance and regulation is changing globally, and how we can play our part in that evolution and hopefully influence it in a values-driven direction, and exactly how to position CTT as a solution for building ethical organizations and find allies in the process. So who am I? Despite my accent, I consider myself a European. I've spent most of my professional life in Europe, although I started, as you can see from the map, in San Francisco, where I became a lawyer because I wanted to change the world, which may seem odd, but at the time that was a thing. I became a corporate lawyer and have worked and lived in the cities that you see on the map as I pursued my career first in private practice and ultimately in-house. My last role was with a company called Borealis, which is a very Nordic-based company at the time. It was owned half by Statoil of Norway and half by Neste of Finland when it was originally formed. By the time I started working there, Neste of Finland had sold out. But the point was that it was a very values-driven organization, and I was general counsel and became head of ethics, and in my time in Borealis pioneered a very different way of doing ethics and compliance, which has really propelled me to where I am now. So I'm a recovering lawyer now, having left the profession in 2009. Since that was approximately 10 years ago, I've now realized that somehow you never recover from being a lawyer. But I did retrain in the sense of I became a fully certified CTT consultant, an executive coach, training, etc., and I did a lot of other things, particularly around behavioral psychology, in order to expand my skill set and in accordance with my value of lifetime learning. So that's just a very short description of how I got here. Let's start out by talking about why the fact that bad behavior in organizations is caused mostly by good people doing bad things rather than by a few psychopaths or sociopaths. You probably heard companies, particularly a few years ago when something went seriously wrong, saying, oh yes, that person was just a bad apple, nothing to do with us. That the bad apple defense has been totally discredited. It's very clear that the barrel is the main influencer on whether people do the right thing generally or not. And there are various things which influence the barrel, shall we say, or the culture from human psychology, from behavioral psychology. And I've put a few of them up here. You'll be wondering why I have a stack of fudge sitting on this slide. But the fudge factor was coined by a brilliant behavioral economist called Dan Ariely. Some of you may have heard of him. And basically the fudge factor is the extent to which each one of us can cheat and still feel good about ourselves. So how much we can cheat in order to gain an advantage, whatever that is. It might just be as simple as trying to get someplace more quickly, or it might be getting more money or something. And basically it's an elastic concept. One can cheat more or less depending on what's happening in the culture around us. So if you work in a company where everybody else is doing it, or where there's a very cavalier attitude towards doing the right thing or towards the rules, it's easier to do something against your values and still think, I'm a good person. I mean, look, I'm just doing what everyone else is doing. That also kind of feeds into this point about conformity, that many people feel that they don't want to go against the main culture. And there's some brilliant experiments that have been done, many of them many years ago, but still making some important points around that. So the fudge factor is about rationalization. It's the ability to rationalize doing something. And as soon as somebody is rationalizing, almost by definition, they're probably doing something that isn't aligned with their values. Authority, some of you may be familiar with the Stanley Milgram experiments done many years ago, but the concept here is just that if you're told to do something by someone in authority, you may be more likely to do it. In a corporate context, it's also the point that your people in authority may be telling you to do one thing, but they may be incentivizing people by to do the wrong thing by the incentives that they've set up or by the way that they're communicating. I always tell chief executives that if they're making presentations about results and about financial goals, and they're not talking about how those goals are achieved, then they're probably sending an implicit message, I don't care how you make these results, just do it. And unfortunately, if they give that impression, then that's probably what will happen. Another reason why people do the wrong thing in organizations is because they just don't know what to do. They may not have the knowledge of what's expected of them in a particular area. They may not be familiar with the rules. There may not be values that can be used to make decisions, or there may be limiting values operating, or they may not have skills. Ethical decision making, for example, is a skill which is rarely taught. And it can be quite difficult when you're operating in a gray area, as you frequently are. And then there's framing, which is the most important, I think, concept in framing is about cost-benefit. So if you frame a decision as a cost-benefit decision, and so you want to understand what are the financial consequences of the two alternatives that you have, and you forget that there may be an ethical dimension to the decision, you can get some pretty horrible decisions. One of the most famous ones many years ago in the US was the Ford Pinto, where Chrysler designed this car to be able to be produced and sold for less than, I think, $1,000. Safety wasn't a consideration. It became obvious that when the car was hit from behind, the petrol tank was located in the back, so it exploded and killed people or maimed them. So a bunch of executives sat around the table and they actually looked at the question of how much would it cost to retool production, which was $11 per car over the life of the car, versus how much would it cost to pay the families of people who had died in the subsequent wrongful death or personal injury actions, and they decided it was cheaper just to pay the damages. And they went on producing the car with the same configuration for another several years before they were essentially forced to take it off the market. So that was a cost-benefit analysis without taking into consideration ethical issues. Why am I going into this detail? It is because it's really important when we work in the area of ethics and compliance that we think about the people, because they're the ones that are doing the doing and making the decisions. Another concept, and this is from ethical business, this is one of the core concepts in ethical business practice, and it comes from aviation safety, and that is that if you have a blame culture, you are very unlikely to be able to learn from mistakes that are made. A mistake, things happen in any organization. In a blame culture, it will probably be covered up because nobody wants to be blamed. The problem will get worse. Perhaps more unethical behavior will be required in order to cover it up, keep things quiet, which means there's no ability to mitigate potential damage, to fix the problem before it gets worse. Eventually these things come out, whether because of a whistleblower or an explosion or whatever the consequences of the mistake lead to. The consequences both to the organization and to the individuals involved will be much more severe. And very importantly, it will be impossible, even at that point, to learn the lessons that need to be learned, because you'll have all of these civil and criminal actions and regulatory issues where there will be some interest for the corporation not to really dig deep into the reasons or to expose them publicly. That means that the ability to continuously improve is severely curtailed. Whereas if you have an open, just culture, which is one where people are not necessarily punished when things go wrong unless they've really acted criminally or intentionally done something terribly reckless, it's a culture where one can truly explore the reasons why things go wrong and hopefully do it at an earlier stage and then implement the changes, because people aren't afraid of being blamed. They're not afraid that they're going to be fired. There will be learning and training and that sort of thing happening. but it's a very different environment where things could come out and be discussed. And certainly when I was working, for example, at Borealis, which is a petrochemical company, we had been through a very big sort of cultural transformation around safety before I arrived, and whenever something happened, there was a very calm discussion about what went wrong, ability to look at all the different factors that may have come together to cause something to happen, and things were put in place to fix it. And it was a very different atmosphere than some of the other places where I worked, where people went to great lengths to not to disclose things that happened and were really never able to learn from their mistakes. So this is a big part of what is important to us in ethical business practice. If you don't have the ability to create an open culture, a just culture, then it's difficult to improve and transform. So some of you, I expect most of you will have worked with plots before. I just wanted to put this up for a moment to make the point that, well, to make a couple of points. First of all, if you look at this, this is a real department in an organization I worked with recently. And there's a few things here that are striking to me. One of them is that if you look at the personal values of this group of people, they have 5 level 5 values around integrity. So honesty, fairness, trust, positive attitude, and humor, fun. But if you look at the organization, there are no level 5 values at all. So the internal cohesion, shared vision, shared values, trust, etc., is really missing in the top values. And in fact, I think it's pretty much missing all the way down to the top. There's one, yeah, there's commitment in the top 20, which is the second to last value. I think this is a very common situation that I've been finding recently, that people are, they have very good values, they care about their integrity, but they're working in organizations where that is somehow taking a back seat, first of all, to other values. And as you can see in this situation, there's a very high level of entropy at levels 1 and 3. And you have all of the kinds of barriers to communication that come from confusion, caution, job insecurity, etc. And there's also in this organization hierarchy, and there's a blame culture. So I would, you get people saying, well, we have good people, we can trust them to do the right thing. Well, yes, you should be able to, but if they're living in a culture where they can rationalize doing the wrong thing and still feel good about themselves, you've got a problem. And I think in this case, and maybe if any of you have questions later, we can talk a little bit more about it. To me, it's striking that you have leading by example in the desired culture values. And yes, you have a lot of energy around the transformational level 4 in the desired culture, because they really want a lot of change. But you've got 2 level 5 values, employee engagement and leading by example, and a real desire, I think, to do things differently. But anyway, this is, it's also important because I think entropy, to me, I think about entropy, or the opposite, cultural health, as culture risk. What level of culture risk do I have in my organization or parts of my organization? So if I'm working in an ethics and compliance department, and I'm lucky enough to have an enlightened organization that's done a cultural values assessment, I can actually figure out where to target my efforts and where to be more concerned or less concerned, because there's a relationship between engagement and culture risk. For the reasons that we talked about earlier, if people are in an environment full of potentially limiting values, they're much more likely to be able to misbehave, however small or large that misbehavior is, and still feel that they're justified in doing so. So I talk a lot about this sort of issue to people in compliance who mainly come from a legal background and probably haven't thought about it. So what is ethical business practice and regulation? So ethical business practice and regulation is the result of Chris Hodges, he is also a recovering lawyer, but he's been an Oxford professor for the last 15 years. And he and I have known each other since our lawyer days. And he wrote a book called Law and Corporate Behavior about 4 years ago, which was 800 pages long, very useful if you wanted to defend yourself or keep your door open or something, but too long, unlikely anybody's going to read it. And the basic premise, it was obviously, first of all, written for an academic audience, but the basic premise was traditional deterrence types of approaches really don't work to change future behavior. So we wrote this shorter book, and Tor showed it to you earlier, basically aimed at both regulators, saying to them, look, if you really want organizations to be ethical, you need to think about, first of all, your own cultures, but most importantly, how do you treat organizations that are trying to do the right thing and who are able to present evidence of that? And the flip side of that to companies and organizations saying, compliance isn't going to work. It doesn't work. We've seen that over and over again. So we have a better idea, which is ethical business practice, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a minute. And if an organization is trying to do the right thing and comes to you when something goes wrong, you need to treat them differently than, say, an organization that doesn't care or is criminal. I'll explain that a bit more. The reason for this approach is because we recognize, if you look at this round, colorful thing on the other side, that all organizations and the people in them are functioning in various contexts. They're functioning in their own national or regional cultures, the sector that they're in. For example, if you're in the construction or the mining industry or oil and gas, you may be operating in a more in areas where corruption is more widespread. Different regulatory regimes. There are some sectors, obviously, that are highly regulated, like pharmaceuticals and financial services. Others less so. Different political climates, economic, financial, institutional, and right down to the situation. And all of those contexts can override good values, strong positive values. So we see ethical business practice and the frameworks in it as a way of supporting people to do the right thing in a very human way. So not in the sort of tick-the-box, punitive parent-child approach that you generally find in compliance. And we're on a bit of a crusade to try to change the minds of regulators and others who are influential in this area to get them to realize that what we've been doing up until now just ain't working, and we need to do something different. So, as I said, the essence of ethical business regulation is about having a relationship between a business and their regulator, in which the business is able to produce evidence of its ongoing commitment to ethical business practice, not perfection. No organization is ever going to be perfect, but its commitment to ethical business practice, evidence of its culture, and the regulator in that situation recognizes and encourages that commitment. Now, that can happen in situations where regulators and businesses have a direct relationship where they're actually speaking to one another. In some industries, there's not so much actual interaction, but it still can work. And when we talk to regulators, we say you need to have a diverse toolbox. We don't want to have the Maslowian problem of if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's important to be able to react to different organizations in different ways. And interestingly, for example, in the UK, the Scottish Environmental Agency and the water regulator, very much of this opinion, and they have a whole sort of spectrum of how they would work with companies depending on where the company is on the spectrum, whether they're criminals, whether they're just trying it on, whether they're kind of confused, or whether they're really champions of behaving ethically. So a few components of ethical business practice, the kind of foundation of it, is this commitment to a holistic approach to company culture based on true core values. I frequently talk to companies who say they have values, and as I'm sure you all do, most of them, if you ask them what they are, they can't tell you unless there happens to be a poster on the wall behind them at the time. So these aren't true values. And the other foundational belief, kind of a mantra for me, is a belief that ethics is everyone's responsibility. This is really important because otherwise, for example, in a large corporation, there'll be a tendency to set up a huge central compliance department, which operates kind of like a police department and sends out complicated policies, which it's developed centrally without consultation and expects people to obey them, which is a lose-lose approach. Whereas if you have a belief that ethics is everyone's responsibility, you'll make sure that everyone has the knowledge and ability to carry out that responsibility, and accountability will follow. Another thing that I've really tried to fight for the last 10 or so years is this tendency of people in compliance to go around selling compliance as a way of avoiding paying large fines and going to jail. So first of all, that sends a message, we're just doing this because it's the law. Secondly, if you did a risk assessment, you would probably conclude that you're unlikely to go to jail because very few people have actually gone to jail for doing the wrong thing. And the fines are paid by the organization and they become a cost of doing business. On the other hand, having an effective ethical culture is good for business. So why wouldn't you use that and rely on that as your reason for why we are looking to our culture and the values that are in the culture. We've already talked about the importance of a learning culture, and this point about compliance. I have to say I hate the word compliance. For me, compliance means doing what you're told without questioning, and we've got plenty of examples in history of organizations that have done that very well, but they've been doing completely the wrong thing. So if it were up to me, I would abolish the word, unfortunately, and it's too soon to do that since, and in fact, because of particularly the American approach, it's very difficult to get rid of it because that's how it has developed over the last 20 or so years. And then there's this point, which is what we're going to talk about mostly towards the end, is this fact that in ethical business practice, it's useful to be able to show evidence of your culture via values assessments and other indicators rather than just activity measurements. So how many people did you train? Well, did they learn anything, for example? A little more detail about the culture and leadership framework. There are two frameworks within ethical business practice. One is this culture and leadership framework. The other one is a values-based ethics and compliance framework. That's more the technical nuts and bolts, things like ethics policies, other policies, anti-corruption policies, whistleblowing lines, things like that. But what I'm most interested in is what is in the culture and leadership framework. And I think it has to start with a well-articulated and inspirational social purpose. I think that's been one of the main issues in the financial services area, where they have not really articulated their purpose as serving their stakeholders. It's been seen as their purpose is to make money. You need obviously committed leadership, and one of the things that we pioneered at Borealis, and which I think is a very good way of getting engaged people, is having what we call ethics ambassadors. They might be values champions, but these are basically people from all over the organization, different functions, different levels, etc., that you involve in what you're doing around creating an ethical culture. And in my experience, you can end up with some really inspired people doing some very useful and creative things to help get people involved in this idea that it's good for business, it's good for us as employees, and it's makes everything, it makes for a positive feedback system rather than a negative loop. obviously you need accountable management with the right personality and skills, and I think this is where we have, unfortunately, a lot of issues, that people tend to get into leadership positions by being good technically, and then all of a sudden mid-career they're managing people. They may not necessarily have had the training and support to become good leaders. So that's something that is really a key part. And then we've talked about banishing blame. That means you need to have an environment where you can have constructive conflict and people don't have to be afraid that they will be fired or otherwise disadvantaged for speaking up. And all of this speaks to having a collaborative atmosphere, working across functions. That's one of the big issues in big organizations, that you have the legal department, the compliance department, the governance, investor relations, HR, et cetera, and they're not talking to one another, when really what we need is collaboration across functions in order to achieve this. Also, it's important to have your systems and processes aligned. This is, I'm sure, a familiar concept, but you need to have embedded processes. What do I mean by that? I mean they have to be in the business. And you have to have your performance management and your incentives in such a way that they drive good leadership and ethical behaviors, and they don't foster unethical behaviors.
Ruth?
Yes.
You have now 10 minutes.
Perfect. Left. And then you've got to have appropriate professional assistance across the board. So this is new. I worked together with Phil and with Tor. It occurred to me one day talking to Phil, I had a bit of an epiphany that the traditional approach to compliance is a level 3. That might be obvious to everyone on the call, but somehow I hadn't thought about it that way. And once I realized that, I also started to say, well, wait a minute, but there's, at each of the 7 levels of the model, there are values which will promote an ethical culture, or values, potentially limiting values, that will undermine it. Now, that's obvious, but then I thought, in terms of communicating with a wider group of people, and particularly if one is doing a cultural values assessment, it's useful to think about what are the values that will reinforce ethical business practice or people doing the right thing, and what are the things that we really need to make sure are not existing in our culture. And I think some of the things that are particularly damaging, one of them is willful blindness. I don't know how many of you read Margaret Heffernan's wonderful book, which I think she's just issued a second edition of, but so many things that happen in organizations, many people saw them, knew them, said nothing for a variety of reasons. Complacency, any kind of fear-driven behavior is going to potentially affect in a negative way a culture. And of course, at level 1, if making money is the only important thing, you have greed. That's a clear danger signal. But this is just something that, so as I say, you're practically the first people to see this. I think it would be useful to think about how to use it and develop it further. So compliance and regulation are changing. Luckily, plenty of regulators are realizing this finally. There's even this quote from the New York Fed, which amazes me because the Americans are almost the most far behind in this because of it's quite a rules-based culture. So if a bank regulator can say actively managing a culture requires a conscious multi-pronged approach that aligns behavior with the firm's purpose and strategy, I'm happy. The other thing to note is the Dutch National Bank. If we have anybody on the line from the Netherlands, they're supervised banks in the Netherlands. They send organizational psychologists out to attend board meetings, to talk to senior people and make observations around issues in the culture that could be affecting their ability to make balanced decisions. In the UK, the Financial Reporting Council, which has its own problems, but back in 2016, they issued a report called Corporate Culture and the Role of Boards, and they basically said directors need to focus on their culture before there's a crisis, and to recognize that corporate culture is an asset and important for protecting long-term value. And then in 2018, they also said that boards need to assess and monitor their cultures and make sure that they do this on a regular basis, et cetera. So this is a fantastic regulatory impetus for boards to focus more on their cultures. Despite all of this, there's still danger. I think, although things are moving in the right direction, my biggest concern now is that, particularly in financial services, which is leading the way in terms of a recognition that it's the culture, but the danger is that it's the compliance people who are sort of tasked with doing something about it, and most of them don't know how to do anything more than make more processes, do more training, etc. So they try to make it look like they're influencing culture, but they're actually just doing compliance. So this is where I think there's a huge need for those of us in the CTT community to step up and fill a void. So I'm hoping that by now it's obvious to all of you that these tools are tailor-made to support the change. And I thought before we went any further, we have a little question to ask. So where is your normal entry point? If you're working with companies, where is your normal entry point for a cultural values assessment or any culture work in the organization? If you could just choose one of those, whether it's the CEO or the executive team, HR, organizational development people, the ethics and compliance or legal departments, or other. That would be, if you could just do that quickly.
We have 20 now, so half of you have entered.
And maybe that some people aren't working with companies, so.
Yeah, maybe. It could also be. We have 23 answers now, 54% have voted. And 57% have the entry point through CEO and executive team. And 39% have it through HR, and no one has it through the ethics and compliance and legal.
Right. Okay.
And then we have 4% on others.
Right. Okay.
And that's 25, that's 61% of the votes.
Okay. That's very interesting. So if I can't vote. If I had, I would be the point whatever that tends to come in through legal compliance, etc. Right. Oh, that's fascinating.
So I think, yeah, now you as attendees, you'll be able to see the result here, I think.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, that's encouraging in a way. Right. You want to close that? Okay. So this makes my point that if most people are coming in either through the executive team or HR, in the integrity professionals in the organizations that you work with are your natural allies, and it would be very helpful, I think, if you could find a way to reach them. Now, that's not always so easy. I have the opposite problem frequently when I come in through the general counsel or the compliance or people that there's a kind of a not always a good relationship between that function and, say, HROD, and it can cause problems, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I think that one of the things that we really need to do is get to these people in compliance, ethics, legal, and explain to them that there are ways of measuring culture, because you frequently hear said that there aren't, and give them an understanding of some of the advantages of this, which you see up here on the board or in the presentation. And I think that we, particularly with this push in terms of corporate governance and supervision towards culture, this is an opportunity. Right. Now, for some reason, my presentation has frozen. No, there we go. Yeah, there are other things that are useful, obviously, in this context. I mean, I've had issues coming in the legal or compliance door, poor relationships, HR believing that they own values. So when I try to suggest a values assessment through legal and compliance, there's a no, not invented here kind of a reaction. The legal and compliance people themselves frequently just really don't get what I'm talking about. They think, well, can't we just write another policy or have another training? And sometimes the CEO and the leadership team aren't sufficiently involved in what's going on in the ethics and compliance space to understand how values would contribute to this. I've also had the issue that even where you do a CVA, it is not utilized to the fullest extent by the people who could benefit from it. So I guess one of the reasons for doing this webinar is to say, let's find ways that we could perhaps do this together. I'm currently trying to develop some workshop material, etc., to use the ideas in the book to bridge this gap. And sometimes also because of the book and my co-author, I have opportunities to speak in different markets and things like that. It would be great to be able to hook up with people who are CTT consultants in those markets and take advantage of the fact that people are getting this message and take it forward. So that's what I have to say. Maybe we can open up to questions.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I think that you could stop sharing at the moment so that we get full screen pictures.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And,
should I start with the first question?
Yeah, why don't we start, because we have 2 questions so far, and there are always possibilities for you to add on more questions as we speak, but take advantage of asking the questions. So why don't you start with the first one?
So Ruth, the first question is from Clive Wilson, who said he's really enjoying the webinar, and thank you. Sorry, my phone. But he's noticing significant similarity with the need for a strong culture for delivering the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah.
Because they're very grounded in ethics. And he just wants any comments that you've got about that?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I've had conversations about that with Phil. And one of the things that we've been talking about is how could we sort of link up these various things. I've also, last week I attended the OECD Trust in Business. They've just launched an initiative called Trust in Business, where the SDGs were mentioned there. And I think that there's a huge potential for this to fit into that. There's several of the SDGs, I've got them posted on my bulletin board over there, where this is extremely relevant. So yeah, I think that's one of the things that we should be thinking about and doing.
Thank you. I think you muted yourself.
Sorry, I did, yeah. Next question is from George, and he says, how do you choose and work with ethics ambassadors or values champions?
Great question. So the first thing that I do is I tell the people I'm working with in the company, please do not choose these people from any one function. There tends to be, oh, we'll just use all the HR people, or we'll just use all the finance people. No, because the whole purpose of having ethics ambassadors is to have input from people who know about different areas of the business. So it depends on the business, but you can have a situation where if you know the people well, then it's choosing the high potentials, choosing people who are well respected, choosing people who are good connectors, so they know a lot of people. In other situations, it'll be the managers who will nominate people, but I always say you ask for nominations, but retain the ability to make a choice, the final choice yourself, because you want a proper, you want a diversity. First of all, you want diversity of language, diversity of function. So you need to really step back and say, okay, how do I get a good good group of people who can deal with all parts of the organization. Also, I mean, at Borealis, we wanted to be able to do our training and conversations in local language, so we had to make sure we had people who spoke all of the different languages. But what it isn't is function. So you don't choose people by their function or their job title.
Thank you. And Adriana has got a question that's linked to that, and she said, would you suggest that the same people who are culture ambassadors are also these ethic ambassadors?
That can be a solution, but it does depend on where the culture ambassadors are. They all, for example, HR people? If they are, I would say no. Not because I dislike HR, but because a lot of people do. A lot of people dislike legal. For another, so you don't want the whole concept of ethics ambassadors to be tied to what people think about as a stereotype of any one function. And as I said earlier, you want diversity of. I did actually write a good practice guide for the Institute of Business Ethics, and it's still in print. It's called Good Practice Guide to Ethics Ambassadors. I wrote it in 2012, so it doesn't. It's not sort of the most up-to-date thing, but it has a lot of these concepts in it if anyone's interested. I don't get any royalties from it, but it does have a lot of this stuff.
And maybe we can see that, we can share that if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd like to say that there are two people in the comment box, Bala and also Judy, who has said that they would like to have they really appreciate your presentation and would like to have your contact details. I'm just saying that at the end of the presentation, which will be shared afterwards, your contact details are all there. Okay. So they know that. Then I think we have Else Nollet, who is saying, what happened with the 111 people at the department? What kind of journey?
So they're in the middle of I don't know, maybe the third or fourth reorganization that they've been living through, which is of course one of the reasons why the entropy is so high. But I would say they're in flux, and they're trying to themselves help the organization transform, but until they get their act together themselves, I think it's pretty unlikely that they're going to be able to do that. So I would say they're not in a great place at the moment.
Okay. I missed that, Carlo. Did you see that?
You missed, the missed question from Carlo. What are your thoughts about how to use the EVA? And he's put ethical values assessment. So, I
mean, that's a particular, like a CVA, but an EVA. I've never, well, let me just say a couple of things. One, there is no perfect, there is no right culture. And one of the things that, which I didn't say, which I should have said, is there are a lot of organizations out there creating ethical assessments that they're selling to companies, and they're saying, these are the values you should have. Do you have them? And I really don't agree with that approach, because it isn't just what are your values. It's what is, what's going on in your culture, which is why Barrett CVA is such a brilliant tool for this. And as we know, it doesn't, there are many different kinds of combinations of values that will produce the right result or the wrong result. I think I know that there's an organization that's used Barrett quite a bit that looked into the possibility of were there other custom attributes that you could look at for risk. And I think one could do that, but I think they also determined that the entropy measurement was a pretty good proxy for culture risk. So you could look at ethics or risk as an additional add-on, but I wouldn't use it instead of a CVA.
I also see that Phil Badley has a comment. How are you influencing the external regulators for the different sectors so that the inspection regime changes its focus?
Excellent question. So I am incredibly lucky to have Chris Hodges to work with. Chris is, in addition to being, he's at Oxford, but mainly what he's doing is talking to governments, talking to regulators. So we are directly in contact with people literally from all over the world. I know, for example, a copy of this book went to Mongolia last year after a conference. There's a thing called the International Network for Regulatory Delivery, which was started here in the UK, but it's a global organization. And one of the areas of research that they are going to be looking into is ethical business practice and regulation. The Scottish water regulators, as I said, environment, drinking water in the UK, banking and finance in various places. We've met with the Dutch National Bank a couple of times. So in all kinds of different sectors, there is the possibility of really connecting with and influencing where they're going. And if you think about it, regulators themselves have a lot of issues. They don't have enough resource to do what they need to do, so being able to have better information, more evidence available as to who they can trust, and where they need to inspect more or inspect less. The UK government funded a pilot project 2 years ago that I did, where we looked at the culture of a regulator and an organization that they regulated, and looked at how this, having an understanding of culture. So I did CVAs of both the regulator and the regulated company, and then they start talking together. And one of the things that I particularly noticed from that was the regulator had the same cultural issues as the company did, and and because they both realized that, there was a lot of more compassion in the conversation than there would have been if you had the sort of enforcement attitude with your tick box, thing, saying, well, how could you be so, have all these problems? So and one of the things we'd like to do is some pilot projects where we can get the regulator to look at their culture and a regulated organization and just follow it over time to see how that affects the trust and the inspection and enforcement kind of regime. So there's a lot of potential in that area.
That's good. Thank you. And we've got another question from Christine Anderson, and she's asking if she's already run a values assessment, do they need to do another one to lift up the ethical values, or to look specifically at ethical values, or to measure the ethical status in an organization?
I don't think so, because I think you can tell a lot from the values assessment. I mean, obviously, you might look at it in a different light. So when I look at a values at a CVA, I'm looking at it from two perspectives. One, the general cultural transformation point, because not all the projects that I work on are related to ethics. But I've also got an eye on what are the things in this CVA that are potentially going to cause problems, culture risk, and where do I need to bring that to the attention of the organization. So I think it's just looking at the results with a slightly different mindset. I don't think you have to do it. I mean, obviously it's good to remeasure after some period of time to see how things are going, but I don't think you have to put any emphasis on ethics when you send it out, for that matter. It's really just, what is our culture?
Good, thank you. That's all the questions so far. I've got a question actually when I was looking at your 7 levels of ethics. One of the values in there was ambition, and that was marked as positive, but I think in a way that could almost be a potential limiting thing when it comes to ethics. So I just wonder what you thought about that.
I agree. Actually, I'm not sure if that's one of them, but there were a few that I said to Phil, we need to put these in orange because they are, so loyalty is another one like that, where loyalty can actually drive somebody to do completely the wrong thing. They might have a misplaced sense of loyalty to a friend, so they'll lie for them or whatever. But yes, I definitely think ambition is one of those, which I would like to see when we publish this more widely in orange.
Mariah's just said, can you show that again? That have you got that?
I need to share
it again, if that's possible.
I can do that. Yeah. Here we go.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can see loyalty. I don't know if you can tell, but loyalty is in orange.
Yes.
There was another one that was maybe it didn't get that way yet. But yeah, there are probably other values which can be double-edged swords, so to speak.
Okay, and I think we've got time for one more question. This is again from Carlo, who said, if you had to approach a regulator for the first time, what would you suggest to them with regards to the CVA?
You mean in terms of having them do it?
Okay.
So Yeah, so what I did, so I've now measured, well, in a way, 3 regulators. The first 2 were done within this pilot, and they were 2 very different regulators, and they reacted very differently. Now, it was a very specific case, but I think what I would say to them is, in order for you to be a successful organization, your culture is just as important. So I would, in a way, approach them in the same way as I would approach any other organization, to give them a sense of the benefits from an ability to better understand your culture in order to be able to change and understand where the changes might need to be done. But in this context, I would also say, if you want to understand how culture operates in the organizations that you regulate, good place to start is with yourself. And there are regulators who are considering this, so I'm hoping that we'll get an opportunity to do more in that area. I hope that answered the question. You're muted.
Sorry, Milton has just asked, would we share this presentation? And just so everybody knows that we will be doing that. So anybody who's registered or anybody who's on this call will receive a copy of this presentation.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think we're also out of time. So
Okay.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I think lots from all the comments. We've got some very happy people who've learnt a lot. So thank you so much for sharing. And as we said before, we'll share your contact details as well. And I guess you will be, if anybody wants to contact you afterwards, you'd be open to that?
Absolutely. In fact, I really would encourage you, if we could maybe form a little group from this where we would all get together and have some chats about this and see what we might be able to do together, because, you know, it's working collaboratively, I think, will be much more successful.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ruth.